On Christmas Eve, soldiers stopped a world war. They were ordered to kill. Instead, they shook hands. In December of 1914, the war was supposed to be over. That was the promise everyone had been given. Young men had marched off believing they would be home by Christmas. Heroes, victorious, untouched by the horror they were about to enter. Instead, by winter, the war had frozen into something no one had imagined. Mud replaced roads, rats replaced sleep, and fear replaced hope. Across the Western Front, millions of soldiers lived underground, packed into trenches carved into soaked earth. Water pooled at their feet. Lice crawled through their clothes. The dead were sometimes used as walls. Between the trenches lay no man's land, a strip of torn earth filled with barbed wire, shell craters, and bodies that no one dared retrieve. If a man stood up during the day, he died. If he showed his face at night, he might live, if he was quiet. By December 24th, exhaustion had taken over both sides. Rifles were heavy, hands were numb, minds were breaking, and then something strange happened. It started with a sound no one expected. Singing. At first, the British soldiers thought it was a trick, a trap, a way to draw fire. Fingers tightened on triggers as the sound drifted across the cold air. Still knacked. Heilage knacked. The Germans were singing. Not shouting. Not mocking. Singing softly. British soldiers recognized the melody immediately. They knew it in their own language. Silent Night. Men who had spent months trying to kill each other now shared the same song, echoing across the battlefield. No shots were fired. Then candles appeared. Small lights rose above the German trench line. Christmas trees, decorated and glowing faintly in the darkness. The sight was unreal, like a dream forced into a nightmare. A British soldier stood up. He expected to die. He didn't. Another stood. Then another. Still no shots. A German voice called out in broken English. Tomorrow, shoot. We know shoot. No officer had ordered this. No general approved it. But the guns fell silent. For the first time since the war began, the battlefield breathed. Men climbed out of their trenches, slowly, cautiously, stepping into no man's land where death had ruled for months. They met in the middle, shaking hands with enemies whose faces they had only imagined. They exchanged gifts. Cigarettes, chocolate, buttons, hats. Someone produced a football. And in the frozen mud, beneath a sky still glowing from distant artillery, soldiers played a game. Not as enemies, as humans. For one night, the war stopped, and no one knew what would happen when the sun rose. Dawn came slowly on Christmas morning. A pale gray light crept over the battlefield, revealing something no one was prepared to see. The dead were still there, bodies frozen in awkward positions, helmets half buried in mud, rifles abandoned where men had fallen months before. The illusion of peace shattered the moment daylight exposed what the night had hidden. And yet, no one fired. Along the Western Front, thousands of soldiers stood in full view of the enemy for the first time since the war began. Men stared at each other in disbelief, realizing something deeply unsettling. The enemy looked exactly like them. Same tired eyes, same shaking hands, same fear. German soldiers waved. British and French soldiers responded. Laughter broke out, hesitant at first, then real. Soon, the silence was filled with conversation. Broken English mixed with rough German and French. Men compared photographs of wives and children. They showed letters from home. Some even traded addresses, promising to write after the war if they survived. The truce spread unevenly. In some sectors, officers tried to stop it immediately. They shouted orders, threatened punishment, even fired shots into the air. But the men ignored them. In other areas, officers themselves climbed out of the trenches. One British captain later wrote that he felt ashamed to give orders that morning. He knew that if he demanded violence, his men would obey, but something sacred would be lost forever. Together, enemies did what neither side had been able to do alone. They buried the dead. German and British soldiers carried bodies side by side. Priests from both sides led joint services. Prayers were spoken in different languages, but meant the same thing. For a brief moment, the war looked human again, but not everywhere. Some units, especially where recent attacks had been brutal, refused the truce entirely. In certain sections of the front, gunfire never stopped. Men who tried to stand up were shot immediately. The truce was fragile, uneven, dangerous. By midday, Football matches were taking place in several sectors. No referees, no rules, just laughter and shouts echoing across ground that had recently been soaked in blood. One match reportedly ended 3-2. No one remembers who won. What mattered was that for a few hours, the men remembered how to live. But while soldiers celebrated, headquarters panicked. Messages raced up the chain of command to generals who were miles away from the front lines, sitting in warm rooms with maps and coffee. The reaction was immediate and furious. Orders were issued across the entire front. Any fraternization with the enemy is strictly forbidden. Artillery commanders were instructed to resume shelling. Snipers were ordered to fire warning shots. Officers were told they would be court-martialed if the truce continued. The war had to restart, because what happened next terrified those in charge far more than enemy bullets. The soldiers had proven something. They had shown that the war only continued because they were ordered to fight, not because they wanted to. And once that realization spread, the entire system was at risk. As evening approached, the truce began to crack. Men shook hands one last time. They returned borrowed items. Some saluted. Others hugged awkwardly, knowing what tomorrow would bring. One British soldier reportedly said to a German, "If we meet again tomorrow, don't take it personally." That night, the trenches filled again. Rifles were cleaned, bayonets were fixed, and sleep came with a terrible weight, because every man now knew the face of the person he might be ordered to kill at dawn. The truce did not end with a single shot. It ended with hesitation. On the morning of December 26, 1914, thousands of soldiers waited in their trenches, rifles loaded, eyes fixed on the opposite line, now no longer abstract, no longer faceless. They knew who stood there. They had shared cigarettes with them, buried the dead with them, laughed with them, and now they were expected to kill them. At first, the firing was weak. Shots were deliberately aimed high. Bullets snapped over helmets instead of through them. Some units fired into empty ground just to satisfy orders. Officers noticed, and they were alarmed. Within days, command across the Allied and German lines issued new directives, not just to restart the fighting, but to make sure it could never stop again. Troops were rotated so that units who had fraternized would never face the same enemy twice. Artillery bombardments were intensified without warning. Raids were ordered at night, sudden, brutal, and personal. The goal was simple: destroy empathy. One general wrote privately that the truce had been a dangerous illusion, and that war could not be allowed to become civilized. From that point on, it wouldn't be. Snipers were deployed more aggressively. Gas warfare was introduced on a large scale the following year. Battles were planned not just to gain ground, but to ensure soldiers never again saw the enemy as anything but a threat. The war hardened, and the Christmas Truce of 1914 became something commanders tried to erase. Letters mentioning it were censored. Newspapers downplayed it or framed it as isolated, insignificant, or exaggerated. Soldiers were warned never to repeat such behavior. Yet the memory survived. Men carried it with them through the rest of the war, through the slaughter of Verdun, the Somme, Ypres. Many later said the truce made the rest of the conflict harder to endure, not easier. Because they knew peace had been possible. It had happened. Without treaties. Without negotiations. Without permission. Just ordinary men choosing, briefly, not to hate. When the war finally ended in 1918, over 16 million were dead. Empires had collapsed. A generation was broken. But among the survivors, the Christmas Truce remained one of the few moments they spoke about without bitterness. Not because it changed the war, but because it proved something important. That even in the middle of industrialized slaughter, humanity had not completely disappeared. Historians still debate how widespread the truce truly was. Some argue it involved tens of thousands. Others say fewer. But no serious historian denies it happened. There are diaries, letters, photographs, first-hand testimonies from both sides. And every year, as Christmas approaches, the story returns. Because it asks a question that is deeply uncomfortable. If soldiers could stop fighting on their own, why couldn't it last? The answer is as disturbing as it is simple. Peace was easy. War was organized. And organization won. After Christmas faded, the war reclaimed everything. Mud returned. Shells returned. Screams returned. But something had changed inside the men who had climbed out of the trenches. They carried a secret now, not written in orders, not printed in newspapers, but burned into memory. Some soldiers who took part in the truce were quietly transferred to other sectors. Others were sent home for unrelated reasons: wounds, illness, exhaustion. A few never made it through the next offensives. Those who survived spoke about the truce rarely and carefully, not because it was forbidden, but because it hurt. One British veteran later wrote that the hardest moment of the entire war was not an attack, or a bombardment, or watching a friend die. It was firing his rifle weeks later and realizing the man in his sights might have been the same person he shared cigarettes with on Christmas morning. A German soldier wrote something similar in his diary. "We learned that day that the enemy was not the man in front of us, but the system behind us." After the war, many veterans returned to civilian life, changed forever. They struggled to explain what they had seen, what they had done, and what they had briefly undone. Some became pacifists. Some refused to celebrate victories. Some never spoke of the war again. And some, decades later, finally told the story of the night the guns went silent. At first, few believed them. It sounded too perfect, too symbolic, too human to fit the narrative of modern war. But as more letters surfaced, more diaries were published, and photographs emerged, the truth became undeniable. The Christmas truce was real. It wasn't everywhere. It wasn't universal. It didn't stop the war. But it happened. And that made it dangerous. Because it proved something the world still struggles to accept. War continues not because people hate each other, but because systems demand it. Every December, the story returns. It appears in documentaries, in books, in classrooms, in quiet conversations between people who wonder if things could ever be different. In some places along the old front lines, small memorials stand, not to victories or generals, but to a moment of refusal. A refusal to shoot, a refusal to hate, a refusal to forget humanity. The Christmas truce is not remembered as a triumph. It didn't end the war. It didn't save millions. It didn't change history's direction. But it revealed something rare. That even in the most organized violence the world had ever seen, ordinary people were still capable of choosing peace, if only for a night. And that may be why the story still matters. Because it reminds us that the most powerful moments in history are not always the loudest ones. Sometimes, they are the moments when everything goes quiet,